Now today I'd like you to take your Bibles and turn to Psalms. Turn to the Psalms, and I'd like you to open to Psalm chapter 14. That's what we're going to take a look at this morning. And here we're going to find a vivid, thought-provoking section of Scripture where David reflects on the condition of humanity in light of God's wisdom. This psalm is one of stark contrast because it reveals the foolishness of denying God, the corruption that follows, but then at the end it gives us the hope of redemption through God's salvation. So if you're in Psalm chapter 14, let's start reading verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, "There is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. They have all turned aside, they have together become corrupt. There is none who does good, no, not one. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call on the Lord? There they are in great fear, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You shame the counsel of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord brings back the captivity of his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad." Psalm chapter 14. So here in Psalm 14, David paints a grim picture, I think, of humanity and its moral decay, particularly focusing on those who reject God's existence. It also addresses the universal problem of sin, and it reminds us of humanity's desperate need for divine intervention. As it said, salvation will come out of Judah. Interestingly, this psalm is echoed almost word for word in Psalm chapter 53, which highlights really how important this message is when you see something more than once. So it's very, very likely that David composed this psalm during a time of widespread corruption in Israel, when people turned away from God, from his commands. But yet, even so, this message is really timeless. It's timeless for all of us today because it offers a sobering reflection on human nature and a hopeful glimpse into God's plan of salvation. So I want to explore this psalm today in 3 points. So if you're a note taker, we'll have 3 points. Point number 1 is this: the fool's denial of God. And we see that in verse 1. David opens the psalm with this striking declaration: the fool has said in his heart, "There is no God." Now, we often think that the fool refers to someone who says God does not exist. That's what we tend to think. But it really wasn't a common belief at that time to think that there was no God. People believed that there was a God. I think we can certainly put atheists in the category of fools, considering all that we see around us in creation, as the Apostle Paul pointed out in Romans. We see all this stuff, and yet people want to deny God. But here in the Old Testament, David actually might be referring more to a moral deficiency or moral decay. That is, to the person who lives as if God does not exist. You see, the denial of God isn't always vocal. It often happens in the heart, and it shapes our attitudes, it shapes our thoughts, and it shapes our actions. And so the biblical concept of foolishness is closely tied to rebellion and not following the laws and the wisdom of God. And you see this a lot in the Proverbs about the fool not taking the right path. So here it's likely that a fool doesn't reject God's existence or is ignorant of God's existence, but rather the fool chooses to reject God's authority. And so this rejection leads to a lifestyle that disregards God's law and moral order. Now, what's striking is how this denial impacts every aspect of an individual's life. David continues in verse 1, "They are corrupt." He says, "Their deeds are vile, and there is no one who does good." See, the fool's denial of God creates a moral vacuum in his life, in society's life, where corruption thrives. If there's no accountability to a higher authority, what happens? Well, if there's a moral vacuum, something's going to come and fill it in. And usually it's a selfish act. So there's an act of selfishness that comes in. Wickedness takes center stage because they've rejected God's moral authority. And, we can see it in government. Look at what's come out from this Doge, and we see all sorts of things that, we're spending money on that, we didn't know about, because there's no authority that people answer to. They think that they're a law unto themselves. We've seen, I don't know if you've seen some comments, I think from one of the senators who said something to the effect that, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we need to tell you anything about what we're spending money on. That's when things get out of control. There's no accountability. But for us personally, this serves as a warning. And even believers can fall into what we call practical atheism, living as if God's presence and authority, don't influence our daily decisions. Ecclesiastes says that God takes all of our activities into account. We were reading this last night in Ecclesiastes chapter 11. Enjoy the days of your youth, but know this, everything that you do, God will take into account. So David is challenging us to examine our hearts and ensure our lives align with the truth of God's existence and His sovereignty. So point number 2 is the corruption of humanity, or we call these sections, the corruption of humanity. And this is in verses 2 to 4. So David is going to expand his focus from the fool individually to humanity as a whole. And he paints a sobering picture of our corrupt nature. Look at verse 2. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, anyone who seek God. He says, all have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Now, this underscores the depths of humanity's sin. You see, God's vantage point from up above, from heaven, reveals the true state of the human heart. Every person, apart from His grace, is tainted by sin. The phrase turned away suggests a deliberate rejection of God's ways. It's not just ignorance, but it's really an active choice to pursue selfish desires over godly wisdom. And when mankind turns away, it leads to corruption, not just in individual lives, but across society at large. And so David laments this is happening even to those who really should know better. In this case, Israel. Israel should know better. They had everything they needed. And I think we can lament this for our case, the case of America. America should know better. The country should know better. They have the truth there if they want it. But they've all strayed. And this psalm no doubt resonated with Paul's later words in Romans chapter 3, and you can reference this, Romans 3 verses 10 to 12, where he cites this psalm to emphasize humanity's need for salvation. He said, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. And you remember Paul when he wrote Romans in chapter 1, he kind of went over, the sins of the Gentiles. And in the next chapter, he goes over the sins of the Jews. And then it comes to chapter 3, and he shows it's not just the sins of the Gentiles and the Jews, but it's the sins of all mankind. Because all have sinned and all have fallen short. And that's the breadth of what David is talking about here, that all men have sinned and all have become corrupt because of their sins. And so the psalm also highlights the consequences of this corruption. And we see that in verse 4, where David asks the question, do all these evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. They never call on the Lord. So here's the imagery that David has put forth of an individual devouring bread. And it illustrates how the wicked exploit others without any remorse. You sit down and you eat bread and it's just natural. You don't think anything about it. You eat it up and it's gone. And this exploitation reflects a complete lack of reverence for God and compassion for others. And so I think for us, we need to look at these verses as challenges to confront sin's pervasive influence in our own lives and in the world. And they really remind us of our dependence and our need on God's grace to break the cycle of corruption and to restore us to righteousness. Point number 3. 3 is there is the hope of God's salvation as we come down towards the end of this chapter. And we see this in verses 5 through 7. So despite this grim assessment of humanity, Psalm 14 doesn't end in despair. David shifts his focus to the hope of God's intervention. Verse 5, but there they are, overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. In these verses, David reminds us that God has not abandon his people. That's key. We got to remember that. God has not abandoned his people. And while the wicked may oppress the vulnerable, God remains their refuge. He is their hiding place. And his presence among the righteous offers not only comfort, but it offers protection. And then the psalm culminates for this cry of salvation in verse 7. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion when the Lord restores his people. Let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. And so this points with a longing feeling towards the future, a point of hope of the coming of the Messiah who would bring ultimate salvation. See, for David, this was very forward-looking. He thought about the future and what it would bring in the faith, believing that God's promises would continue to redeem his people. And for us, this started when we accepted Jesus Christ, that we moved forward and we took that faith and we were baptized and hands were laid on us and we received the Spirit. And Jesus offers salvation not only to us, but the good thing is he offers it to everyone. He offers it to all of Israel and all who believe. And he bridges the gap between sinful humanity and a holy God, restoring us to fellowship with God. And so David's cry for salvation invites us to rejoice in God's redemptive work, and it reminds us that despite the brokenness we see in the world, God's plan for restoring mankind is unfolding. Even today, it's unfolding. Now, it may seem slow. It may seem slow to us in our limited timeline, but God is not slack in his promises, and it will happen. And as his people, we are called to live as agents of that redemption, reflecting his love, justice, and mercy in this fallen world. And so Psalm 14 challenges us to examine our lives today in light of its three key themes. Acknowledge God as the supreme authority. Avoid the foolishness of denying God's authority, even in subtle ways. And let your life reflect a deep reverence for his presence and his word. And then confront sin honestly and recognize the pervasiveness of sin and its influence on our lives, both in the world and in your own heart. And depend on God's grace to transform your life and empower you to live a righteous life. And then rejoice in God's salvation. Rejoice in it. Celebrate the hope that we have in Jesus Christ, who offers redemption and restoration. And live life as a testimony to others of his graciousness to us. So as you reflect on this psalm, ask yourself, are there areas in my life where I'm living as if God does not exist? Can I confront the sin more honestly and seek God's transformation? So let's commit to walking in wisdom, trusting in God's grace, and rejoicing in his salvation, just as David invites us to do here in Psalm chapter 14. And together we can reflect the light of God's truth in a world that desperately needs it.